مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. هنا في أمريكا يركز الناخبون على شؤوننا السياسية الداخلية في اختيارهم لمرشحين من كلا الحزبين في انتخاباتنا الرئاسية، ولكن العالم لا يتوقف إذا تنصرف أمريكا إلى عناية بشؤوننا الداخلية. خلال الأسابيع الأولى من عام 2016 واجهت إدارة أوباما تحديات عديدة. في سوريا يشهد العالم أكبر تحدي إنساني في زماننا، ومع ذلك استراتيجية أمريكا غير واضحة. مع إيران بدأ تطبيق الاتفاق النووي، ولكن تحدد قضايا أخرى بالتفوق عليه، من المواجهات في الخليج إلى عدوان إيران في سوريا. في الأماكن الأخرى من أوروبا إلى كوريا الشمالية عادت التهديدات من الإرهاب والتدفق اللاجئين والأسلحة النووية لتقتل الصفحات الأولى. لو آمل الرئيس أوباما أن يسود السلام عامه الأخير في منصبه بحيث يتمكن من بناء إرث من الإنجازات السعيد الداخلي، فإن العالم لا يساعده. لمناقشة هذه التحديات والسياسة الولايات المتحدة يسرني أن أرحب بفريق يضم الخبيرين مايكل أوهانلون وستيف كليمنز. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. I'm sitting here with a panel of experts to discuss the already momentous developments on the international scene and American foreign policy. So, gentlemen, Steve Clemens, Michael O'Hanlon, thank you for joining us today. So let's start with Iran. What is going on in the American-Iranian relationship, Steve?
Right now, I think Secretary John Kerry and Barack Obama are working very hard with a faction within the Iranian government to try to reorient the course Iran is taking. This is not to be naive about Iran's support of transnational terrorism or the bad things it does to sort of ruffle global feathers. But there is a creeping belief that we don't often talk about here, and it's politically incorrect to say it, and Michael may have a very different view, but I sense that certain aspects of what they see or hope Iran is going to do is it becomes a more comfortable potential partner down the road. Saudi Arabia, in contrast, has been a profound ally and supporter of U.S. national security for decades. All of a sudden has become a more uncomfortable partner. And it was manifested recently in John Kerry's attempt to prevent the execution of a prominent Shiite cleric, Nimr al-Nimr, in Saudi Arabia, a Saudi citizen who was a Shiite cleric, whose execution sent off an escalation between Saudi Arabia and Iran at a moment when our government desperately wanted to try to narrow the gap and differences between Iran and Saudi Arabia, because that tension is manifesting itself in proxy conflicts throughout the Middle East, North Africa region. So the stakes between them are very high. And as you mentioned, sailors that had drifted across a line were detained and quickly released by Iran. Iran put forward a four-step plan that John Kerry has privately embraced as sensible and something more constructive than many of the other partners in Syria had put forward. And while there are tensions, and even on the ballistic missile actions that Iran had committed and our imposition of sanctions, you know, to talk to our State Department, whether rightly or wrongly, they say that that's almost like kabuki, that Iran is nowhere willing to give up its deterrent when it still hears rhetoric from the United States that it feels threatening, and it's willing to pay the price of those sanctions. We know that, they know that, so it's sort of a wink and nod. But largely, we're dealing with Iran in a way after many decades that we've never dealt with before, and there's the hope that Iran will eventually incrementally become more of a responsible partner. It's a tense knot, but I think it's important to disentangle these issues and realize that what we're trying to do is to not just do an Iran deal, but try and seduce it and nudge it and move it away from the irresponsible behavior that has been so characteristic of it in the past.
Mike?
I largely agree, and so just to sort of emphasize the point and to relate it to the different factions in the U.S. debate, now basically every Republican in the country here seems to be against the Iran nuclear deal. It wasn't necessarily so obvious they would be, because it built on George W. Bush's initial policy ideas of using sanctions as opposed to military force. But they decided they don't agree with the specifics of the deal. It was too lenient with the sunset clauses and so forth. Hillary Clinton, if I could now point out her position, she gave a speech in September in which she said about the nuclear deal, of course I support it, I helped negotiate it, but I don't think it's going to change Iran's behavior. And our slogan should be distrust but verify. Distrust Iran in general, including on the deal, but certainly on its broader behavior, and verify very scrupulously how well it's complying with its requirements. I think if a Republican were elected president, at this point they would have a hard time restoring the sanctions and the previous situation. So they may rethink their position on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, but they're not going to enjoy it, and they're going to be with Hillary on distrusting Iran. The Obama administration is more complicated, as Steve was getting after, because there's a part of their brain that feels that the nuclear deal is a specific, good alternative to the use of force. There is no better way out of this, and on its own merits, it is robust and the smartest approach. But there's another part of their brain, and I think the President and Secretary of State particularly, that really think and want to change Iran's worldview and think they have some chance to do so. It goes back to Obama's original inaugural speech, that we will reach out a hand to those who would unclench their fists. That part of Obama's thinking is still alive, and it's most important in its approach towards Iran right now. So they would love to begin to construct a détente. And frankly, I would love it if they could do it. But I sense their enthusiasm and their belief that this is inherently possible may be greater than for most of the rest of us.
I mean, is it practically possible for the United States, on the one hand, to put out the Iran, we're open for business sign, and on the other hand, put up new sanctions to try it, as the president says, we're going to push back on their bad activity around the region? Can we do both at the same time? Or is this just not something that our government is structurally capable of doing?
My answer is, of course we can. And we did during the Cold War with the Soviets. We've done so with China, that we have lots of major global stakeholders in which we have areas of convergent interests and areas that we need to challenge each other and conflict. And I think they're trying to create a more complex relationship with Iran that will have conflict built into it. But just as we had with the Soviets during the Cold War, if you had 17 different bridges to deal with the Soviets and you blew up 3 of them, at least you had others. I think that's the strategy with Iran. And again, I've talked to very, very top senior administration officials about the ballistic missile defense issues, and the comments from them about that were, had those sanctions from us been in place before the sailors were detained, we wouldn't have gotten the sailors back. But given the negotiations we had with Iran, given the fact that the sanctions that we were going to impose, and which Iran knew we were going to impose, you had a window where Iran could behave well and make this a good story, according to John Kerry. But it is a dicey relationship, and we have to realize that Iran is not monolithic, and it has some deeply evil, problematic people that don't see engagement with the West or the United States as within their interests, who are trying to disrupt and sabotage every element of that. And so we're seeing something that could be an illusion of good behavior that could be followed by very bad behavior, which would mean that the investment that President Obama and his team have made hasn't worked out well. But I think we need to look at this in a comprehensive way to say that I was fascinated about this same question about sanctions. And it was made very clear to me from very high levels in the U.S. government, they know we need to do it. We know why they did the ballistic missile. And so there's a sense of kabuki here, where both sides know what the other has to do. And one senior official told me and said, as long as even the Obama administration continues to use rhetoric about targeting Iran, military options, it has to, for a variety of reasons, maintain a sense of defense capacity as exhibited in their ballistic missile. We may disagree with that, but it's interesting that U.S. government officials are defining that logic in the way they're doing.
You mentioned earlier this a bit of a trade-off with the Saudis. Now, yes. If you travel overseas, Iran is a bit of a darling in Europe these days, and the Saudis are in the dock, and they're targeted as being the source of, at least ideologically, if not more, all the evil of ISIS, et cetera. Has that shift begun to seep into American foreign policy as well? This growing distrust of the Saudis?
I don't know. I think we've had such an ambivalent relationship with Saudi Arabia for so long, and certainly since 9/11, that I'm not sure there's an ongoing seepage. I think it's a particular kind of relationship like no other. And we're sort of, bound at the hip, but there's a distance, and there always will be, or at least as long as the two governments are on their current paths. So I personally think it's one that we will live with just fine, because the Saudis have nowhere else to go, and we have nowhere else to go. We need them as a stabilizing influence in the broader Middle East. The world needs their oil. They need our military protection. There is no alternative superpower that could provide it for them. And sure, in their more paranoid moments, they wonder where the U.S.-Iran relationship is headed, although Mr. Obama is only going to be in office 11 more months. So, unless it's Bernie Sanders, presumably, maybe even Joe Biden would be harder line than Obama is right now. So the Saudis have to know that, whatever their inner paranoia is, the U.S.-Saudi relationship has a logic to it that will ensure its sustainability. And they can put those paranoias to rest when they're in their calmer moments.
All right, when we come back after a moment, we're going to talk about the hopes of Syria peace talks and America's role therein in just a minute. Again, our panel of experts includes Michael O'Hanlon. Mike is a senior fellow at the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence and director for research at the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, where he specializes in U.S. defense strategy, the use of military force, and American foreign policy. Sitting to his left is Steve Clemons. Steve is the Washington editor-at-large for The Atlantic and editor of Atlantic Live, as well as a senior fellow and founder of the American Strategy Program at the New America Foundation here in Washington. So, gentlemen, let's turn to another part of the Middle East where Iran also does play a role, and this is Syria. Now, Secretary of State Kerry is deeply invested in Syria peace talks. It's unclear the extent to which the president is as invested, and I want to get your views on this. And where do you think American policy towards Syria is going? Michael, I'll start with you on this one.
I'm a pretty tough critic of the administration on this. I think the only hope for Syria involves two concepts that President Obama is not really endorsing, and one is a confederation model for the future of the country's politics, and Assad could, for example, retreat to the Alawite sector of this future confederation. That would be the natural compromise. And the other thing is we have to help strengthen the moderate opposition. And of course, in Washington, you say that, and people will say, well, there's no moderate opposition to strengthen. And of course there isn't, because we've basically allowed them to be destroyed over the years as their number one supposed patron and ally, and we've been the least committed to this conflict of any of the major outside parties. So we are in a bad spot, and what President Obama is able to do in his brain, because his number one goal is not to get involved. That's what drives him more than anything else. What he's able to do is to sort of hope that Kerry's got this.
So we'll put you down as skeptical.
Just a little.
Steve, what do you think?
I'm skeptical. I agree with everything that Mike just shared, but I want to go a stage higher and basically look at the fact that Turkey matters in this, and Turkey and Russia are not on the same page. And Russia, despite people thinking it is not on the same page as Iran. And you've got the Kurds that are in the mix, and you have about 1,500 various militia groups on the so-called opposition to Assad that are not with al-Nusra or ISIS. And so you've got an incredible fragmentation of interests. I was just in Turkey, talked with various policy officials in Turkey, and heard from them something that we don't often see so clearly articulated, that until ISIS attacked Istanbul, they are most profoundly concerned about Kurdish groups and Kurdish terrorism inside Turkey, Kurdish terrorist possibilities on their border. They don't really care about ISIS. And so when you hear that, you realize we have such divergent interests on top of the mess that Mike so clearly articulated below. Before the Saudi idiocy of executing Nimr al-Nimr, there was potential value in the Saudis and the Iranians sitting down at a same table on talking about an out-of-country issue in which they both have stakes. There was possibilities there that I think now have been dashed. So while I don't have any illusions that this process is going to come to any quick conclusion, nonetheless, the vehicle itself can create other opportunities for discussion that we ought not to walk away from so quickly.
Let me ask you about a couple of American angles here. In our political debates, no one is endorsing sending large numbers of American troops. None of the candidates, and certainly not the president. The common phrase is no boots on the ground. But yet at the same time, the numbers of American forces being sent to Syria are going up.
And Iraq, we have about 3,500.
We got special operation, the numbers are going up and up and up. At what point does this become a semantic game where we have thousands of American forces on the ground in this theater, but they're not technically boots on the ground?
On the issue of U.S. forces in Syria, as best we know, it's 50 special operators, perhaps in the Kurdish area, and then maybe some CIA, and that's it. So it's probably 100. So there is not just a semantic point here, there is an extremely low number of American capabilities right now in Syria. There's a little bit more in the air, but even there we're very limited. No, I think that President Obama's number one motto or principle in Syria remains to do the least possible, and that's evidenced in all of these numbers.
And so he maintains this distinction, this national distinction between Syria and Iraq. We can send a few thousand to Iraq, but we're going to keep any significant numbers out of Syria.
Looks that way to me.
He doesn't. I think I agree with Mike that while you look at both of them and say we have somewhere upwards of about 3,500 in both nations combined, where I agree with Mike, there's 50 to 70, 50 declared and others perhaps undeclared, but a very small number in Syria. Nonetheless, he looks at Syria as an unbelievably complex quagmire where inserting U.S. forces doesn't solve things. So in other words, as we see others throw troops in and do what we're not doing, we're seeing positive effects for our foreign policy of the Russians and Iranians begin to hate each other. It's one of the interesting byproducts of this, and it's reaffirming President Obama's notion not to invest American blood on the ground in Syria.
Speaking as an analyst, I have heard this theme quite a lot. Actually, on the ground, there's a lot of contrary evidence in the sense that the Russians and Iranians are working quite well.
We need to go hang out at different wine bars. I mean, your evidence may be right. So, both stories could be true in different parts of this, but nonetheless, the most important thing is that Mike is right, is that President Obama, despite saying certain things about his commitment, does not want to be engaged in Syria, and that probably is an overriding priority, despite wanting to share other optics.
So when we think big picture here for a minute, it looks like the president is going to end up, in some way, shape, or form, having at least two conflicts still ongoing on his watch, two that he had hoped to conclude in Afghanistan and Iraq, with perhaps a little seepage into Syria. Is there anything that he can do in the last 11 months to burnish the legacy of the war ender instead of the war continuer?
Well, let me start with this one because I feel strongly that even though I was a Hillary guy, not an Obama supporter early on, but I think the president almost gives himself too hard of a time on this question. Because when he ran for president in 2007, 2008, he did not say he was against any and all wars, or that the number one goal for his presidency would be to end everything. He said he was going to fight the right wars and end or avoid stupid wars. And he wanted to beef up in Afghanistan, which I'm sure has been a frustration for him in some ways, but nonetheless, it was a place where we've made some headway and where there was a strong bipartisan consensus, a place from which we were attacked directly. And he wanted to end the Iraq war. And of course, many people think he did it too soon, but at least he's been responsive and flexible and gone back as he needed to. Anyway, my point is that he never said he was just a pure peacenik. And he reminded the Nobel Committee in 2009 when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, I'm not just a pure peacenik. I'm trying to make the world safer is my main job. So I actually think ending wars doesn't have to be his goal. He will have dramatically drawn down our overall commitment to the Middle East in numbers. I think that's achievement enough if we can stay safe.
Steve?
I think that President Obama, when he leaves office, even if he has conflict still going on in Iraq and Syria, the way he thinks in terms of long run is, did he enhance the stock of power of the United States, the perception that the United States can still move the needle as it did on the Iran nuclear deal, change some sense that America is back in the saddle and can deliver on certain things. I recently talked to Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter about the speech he gave on his budget, where they're talking not about these issues, but long-term issues of where we are with China, where we are with Russia, where we are with North Korea and Iran, which are sort of perennials, looking at cyber warfare, looking at electronic warfare, looking at space and these other dimensions, and the investments we're making. It's a very different way to answer your question, that even though these more near-term challenges are there, there's also an eye on building America's capacity to deal with much more systemically challenging questions in the nuclear front, the cyber front, and others that are part of it. And that's what I appreciate about the president, because while we are playing a whack-a-mole game of looking at what crisis is popping up where, we're talking about Syria today. I see Libya just veering off into a Syria-like situation that's really disconcerting, and we may be talking about that next. But there are other equities that American national security has that I think we have to take into stock when you think about a presidency and what fires may be burning somewhere. There are other things we need to look at.
It's an excellent point. If I had more time, it would be Libya, Russia, China, the rest of the world. So we're going to have to continue this conversation at another show. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us on Dakhel, Washington.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول سياسة إدارة أوباما الخارجية المتغيرة، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.